I don't know how many of you had the chance to tune into the Poor People's Campaign, the March in Washington this weekend, which was a virtual march. Reverend William Barber and many others put it on. So it was a beautiful couple of hours of very diverse group of people talking about the movement forward. So if you're at all interested, you can probably find it if you just, Google the Poor People's Campaign. It was really a lot of it. I found myself really moved and inspired. So tonight, I want to address the present situation, always in flux, moving. But here we sit in June of 2020. There's racial strife, there's continuing and increasing COVID-19. The Main Street economy is in ruin. There's environmental concerns and collapse. I was thinking, it's like the modern version of the four horses of the apocalypse. But if you look more deeply, you find seated in the very essence of these powerful, chaotic energies, there really is a robust potential for what might be called a great turning. Okay? Anything is now possible. Anything. It's like the tight bands of antiquated institutions and thought seem to be loosening a little bit. Maybe a lot. So something remarkable seems to be happening. And beyond the important efforts to reform law enforcement in the wake of the latest police killings, and beyond the kind of reimagining of what a more equitable social system would look like, lots of organizations appear to be embracing this as their watershed moment, in their own institutional history. They're asking, what does this current moment demand of them? Or what changes do they need to make to advance social justice and racial equity? For example, this one slayed me. Comcast. We all have our relationship with Comcast, or many of us over time, but they announced that they're committing $100 million to a 3-year plan to advance social justice and equality. And I quote, "and fight injustice and equality against any race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, or ability." This is freaking Comcast. Are you kidding me? And even allowed for a healthy dose of cynicism on the part of the NFL commissioner, Roger Goodell's, his newfound embrace of Black Lives Matter. And we can be cynical about that, but it's still symbolically significant, given all that has gone on with Colin Kaepernick over the last few years, that whole terrible situation. And oh my gosh, how about NASCAR's banning of Confederate flags at its event? That's another remarkable symbolic response to the moment, especially given the sport's popularity in the South, the very deep South. Just imagining that happening even 6 months ago was inconceivable. And for every one of these highly publicized action by these high-profile organizations, there are countless others taking place in smaller, less visible companies, institutions, state and local governments, and families, for that matter. You put it all together, and we might be experiencing a social change tipping point that is as rare as it is potentially momentous. Some of you are old enough to remember Buffalo Springfield. You know, there's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. No, it's not clear yet. Whether this has real power and legs. But there is something happening here. And in the complete unpredictableness of this historic moment, the power of your meditative practice, of this cultivation of clear seeing, joined with a compassionate heart, and the enduring strength of equanimity is never more needed. I can certainly remember the heady days of my youth, the beginnings of a kind of personal social awakening and revolutionary fervor. Yeah, I'm old enough. It was the 60s. And some of you are of that time, energy, and space, you remember. And I'm noticing some of those feelings being rekindled. They're kind of arising again, but in a slightly less rash form, really. And by slightly less rash, I don't mean I don't support a variety of forms of protest or civil disobedience and aggressive actions for change, because I do. Less rash at my age and experience means that my expectations are tempered for what might actually transpire. Maybe my expectations are non-existent, which actually feels a little healthier, more balanced. And when I think about all that's going on in history, if history has taught me one thing, it is that power and resources are never shared willingly. Never. As the Dharma teacher, George Carlin, that irascible social critic, used to say about those holding power and influence, George would say, "It's a big club, and you ain't in it, so get over it." Now, I got to add that behind every cynic is a disappointed idealist. I kind of count myself in those numbers, and I've reflected on it. Yes, it's true historically. Those that have power and resources will fight to keep and increase it. That's why the word struggle appears again and again in social justice writings, in all of the liberation theologies. Oh, it would be great if holding hands and singing Kumbaya would turn the tide toward greater compassion and fairness. But not so much yet in the annals of history. It takes real struggle and sacrifice. That's always required. Always. So where does that leave us as contemplatives? What's the basic Buddhist perspective on socio-political action? What can we find in the actual discourses of the Buddha? Is Buddhism a social liberation theology or a personal path to freedom, or both? How does it all get framed? This is a pretty lively Dharma discussion. Now, adherents to a more classical Buddha Dharma, they voice concern that during times of societal stress, the traditional Dharma gets pushed, compromised. It gets challenged to become more active, more directly involved in social issues. And from that classical perspective, they believe that that was not the intent of the original teachings. And here are some quotes from the Discourses of the Buddha that back that up. It's from the Samutta Nikaya. Bhikkhus, I do not dispute with the world. Rather, it is the world that disputes with me. A proponent of the Dhamma does not dispute with anyone in the world. Another. My teaching is such that one does not conflict with anyone in this world, with its gods, maras, and brahmas, this population with its ascetics and brahmins, its gods and humans. Another, in the Majjhima Nikaya, a bhikkhu whose mind is liberated thus sides with none and disputes with none. She employs the speech currently used in the world without adhering to it. And then there's the 8 principles that mark the Dharma in the Anguttara Nikaya. And it goes like this. As for the qualities which you may know, these qualities lead to dispassion, not to passion, to being unfettered, not to being fettered, to shedding, not to accumulating, to modesty, not to self-aggrandizement, to contentment, not to discontent, to seclusion, not to entanglement, to aroused persistence, not to laziness, to being unburdensome, not to being burdensome. You may categorically hold, this is the Dhamma, this is the Vinaya, this is the teacher's instruction. So that's a little taste of the classical perspective. It's a scripture-based rationale for dispassion, disengagement, and removal from what you could say is the emotion-charged affairs of the moment. And I probably didn't give full justice to it, to this more classical interpretation. But that being said, you might make the argument that the historical perspective of monastic life 2,500 years ago in northern India had an element of self-preservation baked in. These instructions, these scripture-based instructions from the Buddha, his advice was to a very inwardly focused monastic sangha. And now in an arena with warlords and various tribes and constant struggle for domination throughout that whole region, it's no wonder that an unarmed, undefended monastic order felt it important to remain completely apolitical and invulnerable in those turbulent times. You might say, duck and cover. And if you consider it, they lived in circumstances not all that different from our own. In a place that there was a fairly rigid race-based caste system that at times was brutally enforced by the state when it felt it needed to. And right at home in his palace, the young Buddha-to-be Siddhartha got to witness the strong-armed activities of his dad, who was a renowned warrior leader, upholding such a caste system. So the Buddha's world 2,500 years ago was one of extreme socioeconomic inequality, embedded in a very unstable world. Not too different than today. And if you'd been a member of a monastic order at that time, it might have been prudent to keep a low profile for your own personal safety and to try and carve out a safe place so you could work toward your inner awakening. So it's worth considering that maybe the advice of the Buddha around social activities had partial origins in the practical preservation of the monastic sangha. And personally, I never felt all that comfortable with that classical interpretation of the scriptures, and that there was a kind of an encouragement to avoid all forms of social conflict and confrontation. It always seemed to me that the reality of the teachings were more nuanced. You know? And I've always felt that there is a liberation theology foundational in the teachings of the Buddha. But I also am aware of and sense a counter-liberation energy or a counter-liberation understanding as the teachings became westernized. Let me explain a little bit. The merging of psychotherapy with Buddhism here in the West has a shadow side. To me, it becomes, and there's a lot of wonderful aspects of it, but to me, it becomes troublesome when the practice gets conflated with and inadvertently assigns the sickness of a profoundly inequitable and unjust society to afflictive personal emotions. It kind of subtly aiming the practitioner to take that societal pain and injustice internally as a personal issue, a wholly personal issue, to be managed internally, privately, individually, through meditation practice and self-reflective inquiry. I mean, a practitioner might feel, oh, I've got so many fears, the anxiety is making me sick. That person may have fears about the botched handling of the pandemic. They may have fears about their economic situation, or that their health insurance is inadequate. Or they may have fears about the collapse of the environment. Oh my gosh, that little town north of the Arctic Circle in Russia a couple of days ago had temperatures over 100 degrees north of the Arctic Circle. Okay? And if you happen to be a person of color practitioner, it's all even more pronounced. You've got additional fears around your basic personal safety and all the horrible forms of discrimination that you lived with day in and day out. Well, okay, yes, the practice is great about helping you to manage those fears. But darn, I mean, really, aren't they all well-founded fears that can and should be addressed by some sensible, reasonable, compassionate change in the institutions of our culture? So can this sometimes tendency of internalizing the ills of society as our own personal defects, you know, taking them into our practice, can that be a case maybe of religion as an opiate? You know, it's not societal inequality, it's you who is defective. You who are the loser who can't handle anxiety, stress. Now, Karl Marx's full quote about religion as the opiate of the masses is this: religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. So it seems to me that if we use the Dharma to numb ourselves to the intensity of the suffering, that the three poisons that we talk about a lot, the three poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion, are inflicting on our society, our environment, and our health. If we numb ourselves using the practice, then might we be entering the opium den? And we will have not arisen to the challenge of fully embodying the Noble Eightfold Path. a path which includes this beautiful triumvirate of personal integrity and ethics. And whereby central to that path is careful attention to the harmful or harmonious effects of our speech, our actions, our entire lifestyle. In the Satipatthana Sutta, which is the sutta of mindfulness, that is the origin of all the mindfulness teachings now sweeping the West, all of them. In that sutta, the Buddha encourages us to be mindful both internally and externally. I want to emphasize, and externally. To me, that enjoinder by the Buddha is important. This teaching is really broad in scope. It's not just the challenge of internal peace, harmony, and personal awakening. And if you combine the teachings of the Satipatthana Sutta, that critical sutta, with reflections on the precepts, you know, they are not 5 simple guidelines, you know, but 5 fully alive lifetime reflections to live wholesomely in all the aspects of our lives. We're told not only to refrain from causing harm, but also to not cause others to do harm, or to enable them to cause harm by action or inaction. To me, that opens up vast, nuanced dimensions of our choices and ethical considerations. Just as speech must be wholesome, so too silence must not be unwholesome. The Dhamma, in my estimation, really places no boundaries on wholesome actions of thought, speech, and action. No boundaries that's not taken into the public realm, as well as the private realms of practice that we inhabit. I want to end my talk tonight with a little piece from Bhikkhu Bodhi, who has established the Buddhist Global Relief and do a lot of good work around the world. Very similar to kind of the Catholic charities. Catholics do a great job in trying to reduce suffering, as do other religions, of course. This is from Bhikkhu Bodhi. In the end, what is required to achieve a lasting resolution to racism in this country is a change in the perceptions and attitudes that allow these travesties to continue. White people in particular must make a deliberate effort to look beyond stereotypes and see every human being, regardless of skin color or ethnic origins, as worthy of care and respect. Just as we each cherish ourselves, so we must learn to see each and every human being as endowed with inherent value and thus as worth cherishing. To change our perceptions is no easy task. The human mind is governed by a deep tendency to objectify others and subsume them under categories that reflect our personal biases and fears, particularly the fear of difference. We talk about that a lot here. How do we move beyond that felt separation? He goes on, to objectify others is to blind ourselves to their own intrinsic reality as persons, like ourselves, wish to avoid suffering and seek happiness, who want to live and not to die, who aspire to realize their innate potentials. What is needed above all to eradicate racism, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, an unconditional love, rooted in an understanding of our shared humanity, our shared fragility and vulnerability. Such love would give rise to genuine compassion for those who suffer and a desire to ameliorate their pain, but would also affirm our common capacity for leading lives of meaning and purpose. It would thereby unite us in a collaborative effort to create a society and even a world in which everyone can flourish. Given our history of racism and the current cultural norms, efforts to forge such strong bonds of solidarity will run up against both internal and external obstacles. Not only must we deal with our habitual biases and the pressures of our peers, but we will inevitably face opposition from those who benefit from division and want to preserve their privileged status, even though, in the end, such divisions diminish us all. As a nation, we presently stand at a crossroads where we can either go forward in creating a beloved community of mutual affirmation, or we can retreat backward into the bunkers of suspicion, resentment, and racial violence. We can come together to create a society that serves the needs of all, or we can struggle to prevail in a zero-sum game. He finishes by saying, the unity among young people of all races and backgrounds marching along the streets of our major cities shows that the seeds of a society centered around human solidarity are blowing in the wind. The tragedy of George Floyd's killing is starting to blossom in new flowers of hope. Our task now is to realize the potential of this moment and embrace its power until it becomes the dominant ethos of our time. So, I'd like to end this evening, or at least a portion of it, and lead you in a short reflection that highlights experientially some of what I'm trying to bring forward and some of what we find important in the practice. The meditation we'll do, or that I'll lead you on, is very simple, and it's very similar to what we've done before. But it very pointedly attempts to bridge a particular felt separation. And it comes kind of from a non-dual perspective. It is what Martin Luther King had in mind and what Bhikkhu Bodhi just articulated. This attempt to connect in a way much more deeply and out of love. And generally, these kind of meditations may bring up some emotions, and that's okay. And usually we invite you to kind of approach them incrementally. But tonight, I thought, we just jump in. These are such challenging times, and maybe it's more than a challenge than you feel like. It is an experiment, but feel free to pull away if you'd like. Now, meditation practice is pushing the bounds continually of what we can understand and how we can love more fully without discriminating. That's the kicker. So close your eyes. Kind of take a deep breath or two. And so this meditation is in response to, of course, you'll see the recent events, but it's applicable to any situation where you feel upset, outraged, disturbed by someone else's behavior, be it a friend, a coworker, family member, public figure, politician, etc. Any situation where you feel separated from another. And this meditation is also heavily informed by the work of Rupert Spira, and it dovetails with what we're doing. So let's begin by bringing to mind an image of George Floyd. We've all seen his picture, and many of you have seen the video. And invite empathy and compassion to arise. To arise for him, George Floyd. Feel into his being the best that you're able. Feel into his being as your being. And that you care, for and love his being unconditionally. Just spend a moment there with George Floyd, your heart, feeling into his being from your being. Now, in your imagination, alongside the image and felt sense of George Floyd, bring forward the image of Derek Chauvin, the policeman who knelt on his neck. Hold the image of both men alongside one another. At this stage, see if it's possible to bypass everything you know about Derek Chauvin. In your imagination, see if it's possible to pass through the layers of conditioning that turned him into the person he now is. Dropping below his conditioning. Going back and back, all the way back to his innocent, unconditioned being. That innocent, unconditioned being is identical to your own being, and it is identical to George Floyd's being. And with your attention, go back and forth with your attention between these two men, seeing them, but more importantly, feeling only their being beneath the conditioning. Take time to pause with each one. Look into their eyes. Try not to think about anything you know about the two men. Try not to refer to your own thoughts and feelings at this stage. Simply look into the eyes as if you are looking into their being. The being that each of these men share with each other, and the being both of these men share with all of us. the being that is the same being of anyone who we have ever loved deeply. Now, adding yourself with your attention, go back and forth from your own being, feeling into yourself as deeply as you can past your own conditioning, to George Floyd's being, to Derek Chauvin's being. Take your time, moving from one to the other. Beneath the conditioning, touching into the shared being. Be sensitive to any feelings of like or dislike that arise, that are provoked in this reflection. Of course, there's nothing wrong with them. Don't try to get rid of them. But if you're able not to refer to them, maybe see those feelings as a transparent screen that stands between your being and the being of each of these men. And simply feel through the screen. Now, pausing. Instead of traveling with your attention from George Floyd to Derek Chauvin to yourself and back again, see if it is possible to just feel that the three of you share your being. You're no longer traveling with your attention between three different beings. Your attention is just on being, the being from which each of us, George Floyd, Derek Chauvin, and indeed everybody else, the being that everyone else derives their apparently separate and independent existence. That being that each of us essentially is shared between all of us and is therefore not limited by any of our individual qualities or conditioning. It is utterly intimate and at the same time completely impersonal. It shares none of the limits of the person. It is the intimate, impersonal, infinite being that shines in each of our hearts and at the heart of each of these two men, and indeed at the heart of all beings. When that direct experience of shared being opens, that is love. The experience of love is the recognition of our shared being. So look at these two men once again and go back and forth between them with your kind attention, with your good heart, until you begin to feel that you love them equally, or almost so. Now, we are not called to like everybody equally, but in the practices of the heart and in bridging separation, we are called as contemplatives to enter into the process of building the power of our hearts to love everybody equally. It's lofty. It is more than a lifetime of work. People generally are only in touch with their likes and their dislikes, whether they like someone or dislike them. If you reflect on it, what we like or dislike in a person is their conditioning. Deep love for a person has absolutely nothing to do with their conditioning or our conditioning. But oftentimes, due to our conditioning, we may not like their conditioning. And if that is all we allow ourselves to know or feel about another person, then conflict is guaranteed. It is our contemplative sacred duty on the path to stretch love in the direction of loving everyone equally. It's always more skillful in our response to this current situation or to any other situation like this, that the felt interaction is informed by our shared being. If our response does not come from our shared being, in other words, if our response doesn't come from love, then the prejudice and the division which caused the injustice in the first place will still be present, at least to some degree, in our response. And although our response may be effective to a degree in the short term, in the long term, it will not put an end to the injustice because it has not rooted out the cause of the injustice. namely that we do not love each other. So we all have our individual response to the situation, the current situation, the latest of innumerable atrocities. But whatever our response, ideally, the skillfulness would be elevated if it was to come from and be informed by our love for these two people. And that once we feel the love for each of these people equally in our hearts, we're then in a position to respond appropriately and take whatever action is necessary. I'm not implying we shouldn't take action. We should take action, and sometimes very firm action. And this is one such case. But if that action is not rooted and informed by the understanding and feeling of our shared being, in other words, if that response is not rooted in love, it will not have the power to affect the long-lasting change that so many of us desire. So I wanted to share that what can be a challenging practice with you of moving beneath the conditioning that separates us. And so I think this is what Martin Luther King had in mind. I think this is what Gandhi had in mind. You know, that touching into that love does not preclude the firmest action to stop harm and to create a better alternative. But as practitioners, we are cultivating the skills to drop below that conditioning and directly experience that infinite shared beings with whoever we are separate from, which will allow us greater power and a more skillful action to exercise our thoughts, speech, and actions to greater harmony and less harm. So thank you for your attention this evening, and stay well until next time. Thanks.